Feeling. Craving is the root cause of attachment. Because of that, to free your mind of attachment, you must focus on tanha, or craving, and eliminate it. If you overcome craving, you'll overcome attachments. But you cannot deal with the attachments directly. Trying to overcome attachments by sheer willpower won't work. The only way to overcome attachments is to get rid of their cause, which is craving. This is stated clearly in paticcasamuppada, or dependent origination. Dependent on feeling, craving arises. Dependent on craving, attachment arises. Craving being the causal condition for attachment, when craving is destroyed, attachments cannot manifest. Because craving is dependent on feeling, when you aim to destroy craving, you must first focus your attention on feeling. This is a critical point, because exactly at the juncture between feeling and craving a preventative barrier can be placed. Feeling is just pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings. Those feelings arise as a consequence of past karma. Tanha, on the other hand, generates new karma. So, by allowing feeling and craving to link up, you are creating more karma. If you can turn away at that juncture and prevent the new karma from occurring, the situation gradually improves. But the description of paticcasamuppada does not give practical guidance on how to accomplish that. It reveals how the process unfolds, but it does not indicate the way to unravel the entanglement. To unravel it, you must concentrate on feelings. Examine feelings to see how they give rise to tanha. Paticcasamuppada is an account of the sequence of causes that condition the arising of suffering and, in reverse order, the cessation of suffering. The Buddha's purpose in teaching dependent origination was to point out the general pattern of conditions that causes beings to wander endlessly in samsara, and to show how that causal sequence can be brought to an end in the mind. The Buddha emphasized that his ability to bring dependent origination to an end within his own mind enabled him to attain enlightenment. Because paticcasamuppada was a realization that the Buddha reached on the night he attained enlightenment, it was an achievement of profound knowledge and insight. As a guide for meditators, however, it can be difficult to clearly comprehend. For that reason, the conditional factors of paticcasamuppada should be used as meditation subjects with considerable caution. The Buddha laid out dependent origination in the form of a brief statement of the main points that explain how suffering arises and ceases. But it does not teach a specific method for achieving that cessation. To discover the right method for curing dukkha, one must practice the Noble Eightfold Path until the Four Noble Truths are fully understood. That caution notwithstanding, a basic understanding of the process laid out by paticcasamuppada can be an important aid to meditation practice, because it describes a mental process that can be understood on many different levels of subtlety. Due to those subtleties, however, the factors of paticcasamuppada are difficult to interpret using conventional language. My understanding of them goes something like this. Avidya pachaya sankhara means avidya is the fundamental ignorance within oneself, a web of delusion that is extremely deep and all-pervasive. That fundamental ignorance produces the karma that leads to all the conditions for birth and suffering. Dependent on the existence of those conditions, or sankharas, vijnana arises. Those first three factors, avidya, sankhara, and vijnana, are not dependent on physical human existence. They are entirely mental states. The vijnana factor in paticcasamuppada is always referred to as patisandhi vijnana. This is not the standard type of vijnana that we refer to as consciousness. Rather, it is the relinking consciousness that connects one birth to the next. That relinking consciousness forms the connection between past and future, which leads to grasping a new life at the moment of conception. Patisandhi Vijnana is said to be free of sense doors. That is, it does not respond to sense contact. To properly understand Patisandhi Vijnana, it is best to put aside the word consciousness, which can be quite a misleading translation. My understanding of the word vijnana in this context is that the prefix vi, meaning divided, is combined with jnana, which means knowing. In other words, divided knowing. The one mind splits into two, subject and object. Thus, instead of being pure knowing, the mind is driven by avijja plus kamma to discriminate, so that it becomes this knowing that, or the knower and the known. A duality is thus established in which the this becomes nama and the that becomes rupa. Thus, vijnana is a condition for the arising of nama-rupa. Although avijja, sankhara, and vijnana are all conditioning factors, all those factors arise simultaneous to the division into knower and known. No time interval is involved. It's like the railway engine pulling a train. The engine is the driving force, so none of the cars move independently. Similarly, vijnana is a causal condition for namarupa to arise. Namarupa is a difficult factor to interpret. Nama literally means name. In other words, putting names to things, designating and defining them. And rupa is the form, that is, the thing that we make concrete with a name. When we make forms concrete with names, we divide them out from the whole. Looking at the forest, we see leaves, trees, and flowers. We call them leaves, trees, and flowers merely to define certain aspects of what we see. But they are only our aspects. They do not exist as such there in the forest. The forest itself is one whole. It is we who differentiate the various aspects. In reality, our perceptions do not exist as separate entities at all. We separate the forest into various parts so that we can bring some order to our perceptions. This is how nama-rupa works. It is the dividing out of certain aspects of our perceptions which accord with previous recollections. In other words, we are defining our worldview according to our own past tendencies. In that way, we create a world in the present, based on data from the past. This loops back to avijja pachaya sankhara, with sankharas being the karmic conditions from the past that determine rebirth. Namarupa, in turn, conditions salayat ana, which signals the emergence of the sense fields. The senses include the fields of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, with the mind as the field of cognition. It is not so much that the senses are faculties we acquire, but rather that the senses are productive faculties. The sense fields are very actively involved in producing sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations, which are then experienced internally as mental phenomena. In the Paticca-samuppada formula, salayat ana conditions phassa, or sense contact, which takes place in the mind. The sense fields enable contact between sense objects and their corresponding sense bases, making the sense bases a precondition for contact to occur between the mind and its perceptions. Phassa gives rise to vedana, that is, sense contact conditions the arising of feeling. The feeling may be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. In the context of Paticca-samuppada, the arising of feeling is a resultant process that is caused by the consequences of actions done in the past, coming up in the present. Feeling is a condition for tanha, or craving, to arise. Based on the feeling experienced, a personal, emotional judgment is made as to whether that feeling is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, which in turn leads directly to a desire for the pleasant, an aversion for the unpleasant, or an indifference toward the neutral. In other words, there is a tendency to react with either greed, aversion, or delusion. These reactions are all aspects of the mental defilements, with feeling as their condition. Feelings occur first, and then the defilements arise in response. Say, you hear a sound you don't like. Based on that sensation, an unpleasant feeling arises in the mind. That unpleasant feeling triggers aversion. Thus, aversion arises due to experiencing something disagreeable. The sensation is experienced first, and if you don't like what you hear, that feeling then brings up aversion. Because that feeling is unwanted, a desire to suppress it arises. The usual tendency then is to search for a scapegoat. You straightaway blame something, like the source of the sound, for your negative reaction. Angry thoughts and emotions then follow, which are directed at that source. But the feeling of aversion isn't the emotion of aversion. There's no aversion present in feeling. It becomes aversion when you start thinking, criticizing, blaming, and so on. In the thoughts is where the trouble comes. Feeling is a result of past actions, but the reaction takes place in the present. So it's the thoughts that keep the anger going. It's stated clearly in Paticca-samuppada, dependent on phassa, the sense contact. Feeling arises. Dependent on the presence of feeling, craving arises. So the craving occurs dependent on feeling. But the feeling is a consequence of your own past karma, which cannot be changed. So it's something you just have to put up with. Whereas the thoughts are motivated by tanha, the craving to get rid of that unpleasant feeling, which is the making of new karma. Tanha has two aspects: craving to have pleasant feelings and craving not to have unpleasant feelings. Craving, in turn, gives rise to either an attachment to pleasant experiences or a distaste for unpleasant ones, which is the reverse side of attachment. Because of habitual emotional patterns, our attention is usually attracted to feelings when they arise, causing craving to immediately come up. The only way to overcome that tendency is to learn the method of going inward to investigate feelings. Suppose that in the past you were angry for some reason, and the experience of a similar situation in the present triggers a comparable angry response. The anger creates a feeling of imbalance in your mind. Feeling out of balance, the mind tries to restore its equilibrium by criticizing or blaming something or someone deemed to be the culprit. If the cause is greed, on the other hand, the response is to focus outward in search of sense gratification. These are the normal ways that the defilements seek mental balance. Instead of restoring equilibrium, however, the defilements become the causes of more defiled actions. When those actions bring results, their consequences, in turn, act as fertile ground for more defilements. In other words, seeking balance in defiled actions creates more unwholesome karma, which only makes the imbalance worse when the consequences rebound back to you later on. In this way, the cycle of rebirth continues to revolve without end. As long as ignorance and defilements are calling the shots, unwholesome karma will continue to bring unfortunate results, and suffering will continue to accumulate. Only when ignorance and craving are destroyed will the chain of dependent origination be broken, and the end of suffering be reached. To summarize in reverse order, attachment depends on craving. Craving depends on feeling. Feeling depends on sense contact. Sense contact depends on the sense bases, which in turn depends on having mind and body. Mind and body depend on vijnana, the consciousness without doors, which arises due to the fundamental ignorance that produced the karma that leads to all the conditions for birth, aging, sickness, and death. The point where we can have the greatest impact in breaking this cycle of birth and death is at the nexus between feeling, craving, and attachment. It is there that we can start unlinking the chain of Paticca-samuppada. Feeling is a critical link in the chain of dependent origination because it is between feeling and craving that you can erect a barrier that will prevent the process from evolving. It's at the juncture joining feeling and craving that we have an option to either accept or reject the defilements. Craving's reaction to the arising of feeling is not predetermined. The arising of feeling simply means that the conditions are present for activating the defilements. Whether they spring into action at that point or not depends on our state of mind. The defilements don't have to become active. We have the option of accepting or rejecting them. That's where our freedom of will comes in. It comes into play at the interval where feeling conditions craving. When we reject the defilements, we start to dismantle paticca samuppada, which sets us on the course to reach the cessation of all suffering. So let's examine feeling. Feelings occurring now are connected to past karma. The feelings we experience are based largely on how we reacted to something that we saw, heard, smelled, tasted, touched, or thought in the past. Because of memory, we associate an experience happening now with a similar past experience. If that experience was pleasant, we liked it. If unpleasant, we didn't. When a similar experience occurs in the present, we connect it, through memory, with that comparable past experience and react in the same manner. That is, we want it if it's pleasant, or we don't want it if it's unpleasant. So when a sense object that we either like or dislike is presented to us via any of the sense fields, we should try to notice the accompanying feeling, the feeling of either attraction or repulsion, and how the tendency is to react automatically with either greed or aversion. It is the reaction that's important. The feeling arises down in the heart region, and the reaction arises down there too. But the reaction is often supported by a lot of thinking, which is up in the head. Feelings are results of karma from the past, which are felt as pleasant or unpleasant, good or bad. When pleasant karma comes up, it brings a feeling of, I want that, which is triggered by greed. Pleasant karma triggers an adverse response of, I don't want this feeling, I want to reject it. For example, feelings occur based on sense contact. We hear a sound, or we see or smell something, which brings up the memory of a similar situation from the past. We then react to the new situation in the same way we did then, thus making more of the same type of karma that set up the feeling in the first place. Thus, the wheel of karma and its consequences rolls on, spinning round and round without end. Usually, the contact and the feeling arise so quickly that we have great difficulty in distinguishing them. Contact initiating feeling takes place so fast that it is nearly impossible to separate them and see the distinction. But, in any case, feeling is the important factor to observe. We know that feeling follows from contact. Normally, the contact is automatic. It takes place without any intention. Following that contact, feeling arises. It's a resultant process that is caused by consequences of actions done in the past coming up in the present. When that happens, mindfulness should be focused on watching the feeling to make sure that a negative reaction does not take place. In other words, when it's an unpleasant feeling, we tell ourselves, this unpleasantness is my own doing. It's a result of my own past actions. I must just put up with it and not react angrily. We must always avoid blaming someone else. The feeling of aversion is an unpleasant feeling. We must learn to turn inwards to examine that feeling. If we examine it carefully, we won't let it leak out into bad thoughts or actions. It's at that point that we can defeat the defilements. Mind you, we can only defeat them a little bit at a time. To get rid of aversion completely, we'll have to defeat that defilement time and time again until it gradually loses its power to deceive. To accomplish that, we must look within ourselves to find out where these feelings are, and we must discover what sort of feelings give rise to what sort of mental states. It is very important in meditation practice to look for feeling, to get to know it, particularly feeling in the solar plexus region. When we're upset in one way or another, the effects are usually felt down there. Thoughts, speech, or actions that follow the lead of the defilements create unwholesome karmic consequences. Those consequences will come back to haunt us in the future as unpleasant feelings, thus extending the cycle of our suffering. When we continually short-circuit the process at the link between feeling and craving, the momentum built up by the defilements will gradually be reduced, and the offending defilements will slowly lose their strength. Because old bad habits don't die easily, the benefits of our efforts won't appear suddenly. But with persistence, over time, old habits can be reformed. What's important here is developing the good habit of being mindful of feelings as they arise and assessing their potential danger for our well-being. It's almost like seeing a red flag come up, warning us to be vigilant. We should respond immediately by turning inward, thinking, "I must not let this get out of hand." This is a fundamental part of the training in sense restraint. So the proper way to deal with feelings is not so much a matter of deliberately not reacting to them, but rather one of being mindfully aware of them. When we are mindful, not reacting will take place automatically. Mindfulness is a kind of monitor that checks what's going on without interfering with it. When focusing mindfully, it sometimes feels like we are simply standing back and watching the feelings come and go, as though from a back seat inside the mind. Observing from that inner perspective, we can see clearly what's happening, but we don't intervene in any way. Pleasant and painful feelings just occur, and that's all. That is the sort of attention that's required to examine feelings. So, pay close attention to feelings. When unpleasant feelings arise, examine them at the point where they occur. Don't let those feelings turn into thoughts and recriminations. Think only about the feeling itself, not about its relationship to other people. In other words, if you keep the mind inside, no harm is done. The potential for trouble exists only when you let it escape out into thought, speech, or action. By allowing the mind to focus outward to blame external things for your unpleasant feelings, you make karma, and that karma has repercussions for you in the future when you will experience the same sort of unpleasant feeling again. Thus, the wheel just keeps spinning. If you don't learn to correct this recurring cycle, you will never break free from it. To correct it, you must focus with the right intention and not let the mind go out. You must focus inward every time to observe the unpleasant feelings. Accept those feelings as they are and accept responsibility for them as the deserved consequences of your own past actions. Because you previously did unwholesome acts, unpleasant feelings arise as a result. When you accept responsibility and refuse to let your attention go outward, the debt your actions incurred is then repaid, making your burden a little lighter. Each time you do this, the weight of past karma is reduced. Through persistent practice, you find feelings of joy and contentment arising within. You feel happy. That happiness is a result of the work you've done in figuring out how to eliminate the middleman, that is, the defilements. The more you continue along this path, the lighter and more buoyant you feel. This effect tells you you're heading in the right direction. It shows that you have taken the correct path. The more you experience happiness, the more you know that you're advancing on the Buddha's noble path. The defilements spring into action because of feeling. Feeling is the goad that arouses them. For this reason, if you can put a barrier between feelings and craving, you prevent the defilements from becoming active. By being mindfully aware of the defilements and their reactions, you can catch them when they appear and cut them right off. Because they arise in connection with certain feelings, you learn to recognize that particular feelings are the conditions for the arising of particular defilements. When that same feeling comes up next time, you know that certain defilements are bound to be lurking in the background. So, keep a watch out. Keep the mindfulness strong. If you watch that process unfold with dispassion, the defilements cannot gain a foothold, and the mind naturally calms down and becomes peaceful.